Born to Bartolomeo and Bernardo on the 3rd of May 1469, the eldest of 4 children, 2 sisters, Margarita and Primavera, and brother Toto. Bernardo was an adept lawyer and eminent legal expert who earned cash on the side by compiling indexes for tomes such as Titus Livy for book dealers such as Nicholas the German, and the new printing press that was all the rage in Europe. He was not a particularly religious man, often forgoing Mass. The Machiavelli family owned several small farms outside of Florence, housing several tenant farmers and butchers, from which Bernardo dealt with, usually daily. These interactions, particularly with those who were obstinate or late with payments, would shape Machiavelli's understanding of the importance of contract law in his career, and most crucially, how men can be motivated into submission through subtlety. Being a well-read and educated man, Bernardo recorded many of the events of his life, such as his maid's unwanted pregnancy to his cousin and neighbour, Niccolo, young Machiavelli's education, and the books he has read by authors such as Cicero. It was the issue of the pregnant maid that would help to form Machiavelli's views on human nature, negotiation, and how people can be persuaded to do the right thing out of selfish ambition. Bernardo subtly convinced his cousin, who tried to blame the pregnancy on a friend, to pay a dowry for the young maid until she can be wed. This would avoid scandal. Machiavelli begins his formal education in 1476, studying Latin grammar, something he would later refer to as our Tuscan. It was Bernardo's wish that the young Machiavelli, upon finishing his studies, would enter a career in the civil service of Florence. This would likely have been a great ambition for Bernardo himself, as due to his considerable debts from his own father and the small value of his properties, he himself could not enter public life. But the young Machiavelli did observe the consequences of intruding too deep into that public life, when 2 of his father's cousins were arrested for sedition against the ruling Medici of Florence. Their punishments for speaking out against the oligarchs was banishment from Florence. However, this soon proved inadequate, resulting in their deaths in prison. Machiavelli was at heart a republican, but seemed to judge the qualities of a state by their success rather than their form, and it was his great work, The Prince, or El Principe, written for Lorenzo de' Medici, not Lorenzo the Magnificent, but rather his nephew ruler of Florence, in which he sought to advise princes on their duty to succeed, no matter what the cost. Machiavelli was undoubtedly a patriot in his desire to unify and strengthen his beloved Florence, and seeks to advise the prince on how to do so through strength of arms, guile, cunning, and manipulation. Having read of the destruction and conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire, which was achieved through the use of a new, far more destructive cannon, Machiavelli likely understood that the walls of the city-state could no longer offer the protection they once did. Warfare was changing, and with it tactics and strategies must be updated. So to this effect, Machiavelli maintained that loyalty to the state, rather than mercenary ambition, was the true strength of a prince. It is essential for a prince to secure the loyalty of his fighting men through the love of country. Such men should be prepared to pay the ultimate price, and even willing to risk damnation for service to one's country, which makes them favourable in combat over condottieri, or mercenary castes. Machiavelli writes there is simply no comparison between a man who is armed and one who is not. And to that end, it is essential Florence abandon its reliance on mercenaries and adopt a system of yeomanry, or what today we would call the militia system. This tradition dates back to the 1188 sizes of arms of King Henry II. It is the concept of the armed citizenry, or yeomanry, that carries arms but is required to fight with them and be called upon in service to the state during times of war. Machiavelli sold the idea during his time as a civil servant, and his new citizen army performed well against the city-state of Pisa. However, Machiavelli failed to factor practical military science into the equation, and in 1512, his army was routed by a more professional, battle-hardened Spanish army fighting for the Medici. This allowed the return of the Medici and the end of the Soderini Republic. The reinstated de' Medici soon discovered a plot to oust him. Machiavelli's name is 7th on that list, and so he was arrested, tortured, and exiled from Florence. There is not much evidence that Machiavelli was part of this plot, but it mattered little. The exile from Florence was the real torture for Machiavelli, and he felt that the Soderini was soft and weak in this instance and did not act with the ruthlessness required of a prince and the need to employ all methods in pursuit of victory. This opens into what has made Machiavelli such a controversial figure throughout history, his notion that the ends justify the means. a central tenet of his political beliefs that would be overwhelming in the context of the prince. During his exile, Machiavelli buried himself attending to the estates of his father, drinking wine with the locals and writing in his father's study. Machiavelli was busy writing his discourses on Titus Livy, the Roman historian, when he diverted his pen to the prince. Why the muse pointed him in this direction is unknown. He may have felt the tug of politics most keenly in his exile from Florence, and wrote the prince on a way of weaving his way back into political circles. Machiavelli writes that a prince must be prepared to ignore his good faith, just sense, kindness, and charity. If he can avoid this and solve his problems peacefully, then take the high road. If not, then a prince must use any and all means at his disposal to safeguard his principality and to protect his power. And to that end, act without restriction of morality and ethics. Torture must be implemented if absolutely necessary, but never for its own sake. Murder is inexcusable. If the person in question is of appropriate threat to the prince, then it becomes excusable. State and lies and perjury must be utilized to placate the masses from uprising, which will be harmful to them in the long run. Why did Machiavelli write this abandonment of humanity? Was he bitter at his rejection, or did he understand how being conquered through weakness can lead to absolute destruction? Machiavelli foreshadowed a term we use post-World War II, the concept of the Supreme Emergency Exemption. This term was coined by the eminent philosopher Michael Walzer in the study into justification and ramifications of using extreme measures during war. The more severe threat calls for the more stringent action, and in doing so, dissolving of more and more codes of ethics and morals. Machiavelli maintained that the most abhorrent crime was what we call ethnic cleansing. This he had witnessed by Ferdinand of Aragon's expulsion of the Rana's from Spain, and truly feared this for his own beloved Florence. Machiavelli understood well what oblivion meant, and instructs the prince that he lives in a world where not everyone shares his own version of reality, replete with morality. In order to survive against the odds and an implacable enemy, one must understand that any justification can be issued, and the ends do justify the means if complete destruction is averted. The difference for Machiavelli between actions such as this and the use of barbarism was the act in accordance to the common good of the people. If his own people and state weren't left unharmed by actions, then this passes Machiavelli's test for justification. However, Machiavelli warns the prince that there are some cruelties that are never tolerated, and the most offending instance are using this exemption as excuse to become tyrannical. He uses the example of Agathocles of Sycarus as a stark warning to the prince. The tyrant Agathocles was respected but despised by Machiavelli for committing heinous acts for no end that was justified, namely the selfish consolation of power and the destruction of his own republic and transformation into a dictatorship. Agathocles broke a cardinal rule of Machiavelli, which is that the prince must avoid being hated by his people. Being feared, on the other hand, was a different story. When Machiavelli proposes this question, he states that in any ideal situation, everyone wants to be loved. But however, Machiavelli maintained a premise that all peoples were naturally bad and motivated by greed and selfish desire before all else. Being a beloved figure opens the possibility of pretenders and charlatans exploiting one's loving nature and then removing the prince from his power. Love is not a motivating force for Machiavelli. He prefers that a prince be feared and knows where to set the limits with those whom he rules and deals with. He observes that the prince's opponents will be more emboldened to attack a man known for love rather than one known for fear. After all, with fear comes the dread of consequences that can motivate the populace who pay homage to the prince, who must then show a compassionate side. As many members of the mafia have observed, it is easy to catch flies with honey than vinegar. Reputation is everything for Machiavelli. Not just the ability to be feared, but also the impression of integrity and honesty which a prince must radiate. Be prepared to break whenever the situation calls for it, if necessary to commit cruel actions. That it must not only be justified, but appear to the masses to be justified. The prince must allow and be prepared to display his virtue. To Machiavelli, this is to embody those qualities that are so necessary for a prince to be successful. Guile, cunning, ambition, and courage are essential elements of virtue for the prince to keep his power, and there are two aspects that Machiavelli insists are essential qualities to have for the protection of the prince's power. These are the cunning of the fox and the strength of the lion. the cunning to outwit your opponents in court and palace, in trades and compromises, and the strength of the lion in battle, martial courage and prowess was, as seen earlier, essential to the prince.